In my inconsistent mini-series about why everybody hates Reagan, and in a number of my other videos, I often get the question of, sure, maybe Reagan and Nixon ruined a lot of shit, but that's been 40 plus years ago now. Why haven't the Democrats, or why hasn't anybody fixed it? I've gotten the question so much, it's getting its own video. And the analogy I usually use in the comments, because we've got limited character space, is that it's a lot easier to wreck a car than to fix one. You can total that car into a tree in a matter of seconds, but if you want to rebuild it, it's going to take some time and effort. If you want to rebuild that car, you're going to need people who know how to help you and want to help you. You're going to need money. You're going to need tools and parts and time. If something's broken in society or in our government, it's the same thing. It's going to take time. It's going to take money. It's going to take people who know how to fix it and people who are willing to fix it and work together to fix it. And in the words of Johnny Cash, it's got to be done one piece at a time. We tend to look at big legislative wins or budget structures or bills as individual entities, but they're not. They're built on foundations of countless other things that had to happen to get to those pieces of legislation, to get to those budgets, to get to those programs. Affirmative action, for example, which just got overturned, has been in the making since before we were a country. Anti-slavery sentiment and England abolishing slavery happened while we were still colonies. And then you had the free states and the slave states and John Brown and the border wars and the Alamo fighting over slavery. You had the Civil War and Jim Crow and all the segregation and the redlining and then the desegregation and the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s. And affirmative action was built on the foundation of all of those things that came before, and tugging and pulling between opposing parties for literally centuries. This is the same with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, built on top of the suffrage movement, built on top of birth control rights. This is the same with the high progressive tax rates we had in the 1950s that worked for our economy. They didn't just one day decide to have 90% top tax rates. It was built with constitutional amendments and needs for wartime revenues. It's the same with antitrust laws and every piece of environmental and worker regulation and protection. Every piece of policy and every government procedure we have is like a tower of Legos that has been built between two children fighting over how they want to put those pieces together. And those pieces ended up getting put where they were because the right or wrong people were in the right place at the right or wrong time in the right or wrong conditions in our country to make those things happen. It takes a perfect storm of conditions and people to get these really impactful pieces of legislation put through, to get these really impactful societal changes made. So when you get one toddler like a Nixon or a Reagan or a Trump or their Supreme Court nominees to pull out one of those pieces, like the Roe v. Wade piece or the affirmative action piece or the 90, 80, 70, 60, 50, 40% tax rate pieces, suddenly all the pieces that were built on those pieces come out too, or makes the whole structure weaker. You once again need the right people who have the right conditions with the right know-how to put those pieces back. And those conditions means that the party that wants to change, wants to fix those things, needs to have total control, which basically never happens, because once again, a lot of the pieces that would have given them that power have already been pulled. Now you need super majorities in the Senate. You need everybody in your party working together. You need the social unrest. You need the financial needs. You need the social needs. You need everything apparent and painful. You need a court that's not packed full of partisan hacks that are going to strike your policies down because their party doesn't like it. And even if you do manage to get all of those things, you still have an entire opposing faction fighting tooth and nail to keep you from putting even parts of those pieces back in place. You've got the Strom Thurmonds and the Mitch McConnells and the Rafael Cruzes reading green eggs and ham to filibuster your bills, refusing to vote to approve Supreme Court justices that are appointed for life. So we still have the remnants of Reagan and Daddy Bush and Baby Bush dictating policy in the Supreme Court today. Each one of these pieces that they pull is pulled to consolidate power and weaken opposition to their power. Citizens United, overturning fairness doctrine, stacking the courts, gerrymandering, changing congressional simple majority voting rules and filibuster rules, union busting and right to work laws, voter suppression, the list goes on and on and on. All of these things means putting those pieces back or fixing the damage has that many more obstacles to get over. It's that much harder than putting them there in the first place and keeping them there. And that's a lot harder to do than pulling those little pieces out or breaking those things, because you can pick at at these things for a long time, and you don't even necessarily have to overturn them. You can just change little pieces of policy that cripple entire pieces of legislation. And that has a domino effect. It cripples more legislation. It consolidates more power. And on top of all of that, you've got state governments and local governments that need to work together to fix a lot of these things on state, local, and federal levels. So working together is something they suck at doing. Our country, our society, our government has lots of moving pieces, and to get anything done, they all mostly need to be moving in a similar direction, and that basically never happens. So then the question of why, after all of these years, these 30, 40 years, why haven't the Democrats fixed it? Why hasn't anybody fixed it? Starts to seem like a lot more of a ridiculous question. Because in reality, in the grand scheme of things, it hasn't been all of these years. It's been a minute. And where it's always been an uphill battle, it's gotten steeper and steeper to the point where now we are fighting up a cliff. On top of all of that, on top of the fight getting harder, you got the fact that, yeah, the Democrats generally want to help more than the Republicans. They still have big corporate donors. They still have lobbyists that lobby them for things. They still have their own financial interests. They still have elections that they need to win, and they still have people they need to appeal to. So while the Republicans are more blatant about how they're beholden to their donors and their lobbyists and their outright corruption, the Democrats have a whole host of similar motivations and influences that don't necessarily align with our best interest. And that makes our battle as citizens, as individuals, even harder, because it only gives us the option to choose between leaders who are actively trying to destroy the country and the ones that by and large keep their seats by maintaining the status quo because that's all they have to do to look like the good guys. So when I blame things on Reagan or Nixon and I say that everything wrong in the world today is Reagan's fault, and the idiots who don't understand what hyperbole is come out of the woodwork and be like, oh, that's a dumb take to say that everything is one person's fault.
The other people who come on and, oh, you can't blame everything on a guy who hasn't been president for 40 years.
Yeah, I can, because 40 years ago might as well have been yesterday in the way that government moves. And all of those policies and procedures and Supreme Court appointments and wrecking up the place that those people did 40 or 50 years ago, those are the foundations, the precedents, the policies and procedures that dictate how our country runs, operates, and functions today. The wheels of progress always turn a lot slower than the wheels of repression and regression. Try to keep that in mind.